Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler Podcast. In today's episode I'd like to continue with this theme of speaking about somewhat controversial points by speaking about some misconceptions about the industry and how it functions. Now, the industry is rather opaque in terms of avoiding showing certain sides of itself to the consumer, and this is with regards to the way brands are run, operated, and just the general size of brands too. Even aspects which would seem obvious are so often confused and mixed for a number of reasons, whether it's due to the way brands present themselves or the way journalists present the brands. So today I'd like to speak about these misconceptions and some of the oddities of this watch industry. So if you'd like to learn some of the truths within this industry about how brands operate and some of the rather peculiar choices which they've made, stick around. Of course, I'd like to remind you that this isn't just available here on the YouTube channel, but also if you use the RSS link in the section down below, or indeed if you simply go over to SoundCloud or to Spotify, you'll be able to find this podcast very easily and listen to it there. And it will be available on iTunes soon enough, but there have been a few complications with that, so I will of course keep you informed. But for more stories, interesting features, and also wallpaper-grade photography, do head over to watchchronicler.com for new updates about new releases, as well as interesting articles about the history of watches, or just reflections about the industry which might reveal sides which you haven't seen before. One brief note though before I begin, which is that I've been ill for the last few days, so I do apologise if my voice is a little bit odd today, but do bear with me. The place I'd like to begin with this industry is the scale of the brands which participate within the production of watches in it. And with this point we could look at several brands, but I think two which are an appealing comparison and one which actually make an awful lot of sense in recent times are Longines and Zodiac. And Longines is a long-standing brand which has a significant following, and within the Swatch Group, which is of course an enormous producer of watches and watch components, they are a very, very major seller, sitting above Tissot and with a more appealing and far better constructed design aesthetic, and below Omega. Although, of course, historically they competed with Omega, but within the modern framework they sit slightly below that. By comparison, Zodiac is owned by the Fossil Group, which, originating from the US, is known for fashion watches as opposed to Swiss mechanical watches as such. And Zodiac is often compared to Longines by a lot of journalists, and also by the consumer as well, because they are watches operating within the same price segment, with comparable mechanical features, or at least the features you would feel, albeit there are supply differences. But fundamentally they operate within the same sort of consumer and price segment. However, there is a very significant difference between these companies, which are compared extremely closely, and compared as though they are equivalent products, when the fact of the matter is that Longines has an annual turnover of 1.5 billion Swiss francs, with about 1.4 million watches produced each year. That's just over 3,800 per day, assuming they operate every day of the year. By comparison, Zodiac produces extremely few watches. In fact, some of their limited editions, which are usually produced in 182 pieces, because they were founded in 1882, are produced in more numbers than their standard production watches. So, for example, the very popular watermelon version of their Super Seawolf dive watch, once it sells out in the UK this year, will not reappear on the UK market until the very end of 2020. And even then, there will only be a handful entering the UK, as far as I'm aware. And so this is quite a significant difference in production, and does show the fact that in reality the consumer for both of these brands is rather different, yet we're sold the idea that they are comparable. Likewise, there's the misconception for the delays taken when ordering watches from smaller brands, and this is an interesting one to consider too, and I'll use Longines as another example here actually, because it is a fantastic example, because it sits in the same price range as a lot of the smaller brands which do tend to have longer waiting lists, and I'll use Zinn as the other example. Now, Longines has an enormous catalogue, because they appeal to watch lovers as well as people who just want a nice watch. This is a perfectly valid place to sit in the market when you can produce enough watches for that. By comparison, Zinn, a very technical brand, produces 87 different models, despite the fact that they produce a fraction of the number of watches Longines produces in a year, much closer to the numbers they might produce in a few days, as opposed to in a year. So you can imagine the waiting lists when you consider that a workforce which is an order of magnitude smaller tries to put out the same number of models. It simply is a remarkable feat. They can produce anything like the number of models they offer on their website. And it's no wonder that a lot of retailers don't sell their full range, because quite frankly I can see it being a real inconvenience. But nonetheless, it does make sense that one would have to wait longer for a product of this nature, bearing in mind the difference in the brand style. Curiously, this is also an industry which is much more old-fashioned than it first seems. And this depends, of course, on the brand, and usually larger brands operate in a much more modern manner in the sense that their products are standardised. But this isn't always the case. And you notice this, for example, from some smaller brands, like Squale, for example. Now, this is a small family-owned brand and family-run brand, and inevitably doesn't have the same sort of organisation. And by that, I just mean not the same style of organisation as larger groups. And so, for example, if you take a look at the wonderfully made and really rather beautiful watch, which is the 1521 or the 50 Atmos, you will notice that different watches have different features. So, whereas, for example, if you get an Oris Aquis, you get the same watch. If you buy two different Squale 1521s from different sellers, there is a possibility that some will have 60-click bezels and some will have 120-click bezels, depending upon how they came out of the company. And you see, it's these sorts of details which are very interesting on vintage watches, in terms of details not necessarily being the same across different models, and there being different variants produced, with no necessary reason for them. Most people don't realise that these things still do exist in this industry, because of just how small some of these brands still are, and that it's very easy to mistake them for much larger brands because of the media presence they have, or because of how they've been hosted and shown by magazines and people like myself on YouTube and having their own blogs. But the truth is, these are still small brands. Of course, in an online world where we read a certain set of specifications, it's very easy to assume that all of these products are going to be the same. But in an industry similarly like this, one does see these discrepancies, and it is just part of the industry which is very easy to brush under the carpet as something which stopped happening years ago, but still is the truth, and I wonder if it'll have an effect on the collector market in future years, because if we can learn anything from today's watches which are collectible, it's that they weren't collectible at the time, or at least that certainly isn't any kind of deciding factor on whether something will be a collector's piece in the future. So it's anyone's guess what will be collectible in the future. And so one does have to wonder how these different quirks will be perceived by collectors in years to come. One somewhat peculiar aspect of this industry is a new sales tactic, and previously it's fairly clear that watches were sold via an authorised dealer. For most of the 20th century this was the case, where if you wanted to buy a watch you would go to the authorised dealer for that particular brand and buy the watch there, or if they didn't have it, order the watch in. But now we see a very different way which brands are trying to approach to make more money from each watch, and I can understand why, with mixed results, which I think is a very interesting theme to talk about. Because the traditional way of selling, you have to sell the watch for a reduced industrial price to the dealer, for them to then sell the watch on for the full retail price and make the difference in terms of their income from that particular sale. Now this works because a lot of these dealers already have a client base, which is prepared to come in, look at their watches, and trust their judgment in terms of being shown something they might not have already seen before, or being shown something to spend their money on. But brands are now turning towards the idea of selling online, or more rarely, it must be said, via shops owned by that brand in particular, something which is only possible for the largest of brands who are able to afford this sort of service. But so by using the tools which have been given to brands in the form of the internet, and the ability to sell directly to consumers rather than having to have some kind of intermediate stage, they're able to avoid spending the additional costs they would on the margin which the seller would have normally made. And this has pros and cons, and as I've said, brands with an enormous presence don't really have to worry about this because they're able to access the consumer. They have a following. But a lot of smaller brands are inclining towards this concept of selling because it does seem more lucrative. Yet the reality appears to be, at the moment at least, and increasingly so, that these brands don't have the reach, and so they're making more money per sale, but they're actually having so many fewer sales than they would originally have had via a sort of an affiliate seller, that it doesn't seem to be cost effective. Now, this may change in the future, but certainly the trend appears to be the fact that we're returning towards it being more lucrative to sell via an authorised dealer, which does make sense because this allows after-sales care to also not be a burden which the brand has to suffer, but something which is taken care of by someone who does this professionally. In many ways, this is much like the phenomenon where brands which have a particularly technical approach attempt to increase their reach by putting their watches into luxurious shops. And generally, the trend tends to be that they sell less watches as a result of this, because the wrong customer is coming across the watches, instead of it being a smaller audience, but an audience which is prepared to buy. Which is an interesting point, because it's something which a lot of brands don't notice, or don't realise until they've tried it, which strikes me as very interesting, and something which we wouldn't have seen really in the industry in, say, the 70s or even the 60s, when watches weren't the same style of luxury product as they are today at every price level, as opposed to simply being luxury items when one had, for example, a gold watch, or something of particularly high physical value. And whilst it sounds perfectly academic to speak about these sorts of changes to the way watches are sold in principle, but in practice they have really quite major effects. Some brands like Fortis, for example, tried selling their watches in the US market with enormous discounts offered, with the aim of marketing their watches to a wider audience and to really broaden their sales. And the result is, and I say this based upon information I've heard, so don't take it for gospel, but the quality control has gone through the floor, which is sad. Now, I don't know if this has changed since that took place, but it certainly seems to be the case that these can have very large detrimental effects to brands, which can occur extremely quickly due to the fact that a lot of misconceptions exist within the circle of brands as well as the circle of consumers, which does make this industry all the more concerning in some moments, and seem rather more amateur than the image which we're sold of brands who really, quite frankly, know what they're doing. The final peculiarity of this industry is perhaps the most interesting, certainly the one which has been on my mind recently, because I think that it's a really, an entirely unprecedented change to the industry. And this is the concept of magazines or online publications usually also selling watches. And of course we've seen this sold by Hodinkee and Revolution, as well as Worn and Wound being really primary advocates of this type of sales system. And I'm not at all approaching this subject to try to say anything detrimental about these particular institutions. But I do think it's important to talk about this concept because it has some ramifications on brands which are both unexpected, but also sway the industry in somewhat questionable directions. Now, in an age when advertising budget is starting to dry up for a lot of magazines and publications, it's understandable that a different source of income is needed, and the concept of a shop is no new one, but a very, very sensible one, in fact, to be able to benefit from the audience which is already so fascinated and is reading their publication or watching their videos, whatever their form of media might be. But if we ignore the potential bias which selling the same products as you advocate may have, well, there is also the other aspect, which is the way this influences the brands which they're selling. Now, usually these sorts of publications don't sell the full range from a brand, even if they're the authorised seller. They will sell a select collection of watches which they know will sell. And this is fair enough, because why would you stock watches which you know aren't going to sell particularly well? But this means that you end up with a situation where certain products which are being sold by this magazine, which has an enormous following, are extremely popular, but it's not actually supporting the brand, because they're not selling any more than they would through another dealership, and also because of the size of these magazines, they're often getting first access to some of these products. So it creates a peculiar situation, and this is before we speak about the limited editions. And you see these appear which very regularly cost significantly more than the standard production watch from other brands, but they're not being sold via a normal retailer stream. And it makes perfect sense if you're a magazine to sell limited editions, because as far as they're concerned, they want to spend the least amount of time with money invested in solid products before they're shipped out and sold, thus making a profit and no longer having money held out in stock. So having a limited edition which sells out in an hour, a day, even a few minutes sometimes, makes fantastic sense. But the difficulty with this is that whilst many brands do invest in this direction, it seems that the clients which are benefiting, or at least being excited and enticed by this concept, are those who are already very invested in that magazine's product. And this makes perfect sense. Those who enjoy the way the magazine does things will then appreciate the way they've worked on designing a watch with a given brand. But you also have speculators who are buying the watch based upon the fact that it will likely sell out very quickly and thus have a very high resale value. So you're attracting these two clients, neither of which are people who are going to go to the brand and buy a watch. Whereas with a normal style of sales chain, you're more likely to have the return customer. So it does raise an interesting question as to whether this actually benefits brands. And based upon what I know at this point, I don't think it does. Although I'd be fascinated to hear what you and everyone who happens to be listening to this podcast thinks of this concept and the various other concepts in this podcast in the comments section down below on YouTube. If you happen to be listening to it elsewhere, then do just pop over to YouTube to leave your thoughts, because I'd be very, very interested to hear what you think. Because these are questions which are going to have a major effect over the next few years, and certainly the way in which this industry works is by no means logical, at times not even sensible, quite frankly, because these sales tactics appear haphazard at times, and the way brands invest their money into certain ways of ultimately fulfilling their goal, which is to sell products, seem to be quite roundabout and not always the most direct way of getting a profit, which is what they're after at the end of the day. You can go on about brand prestige and heritage and all of this all you like, but at the end of the day this is business, not pleasure for the brands. So I think these are fascinating themes, and I'd be fascinated to go into them in more detail in future. But in this podcast I really did just want to round off a few of these curious aspects of the industry, misconceptions and sides which are very rarely discussed, and are often cloaked in very eloquently worded marketing, rather than being clear about the finances behind this industry. I must also say that this will be the last podcast from Watch Chronicler of 2019, because the next one will be on Christmas Day, and I will be taking that day off, with these podcasts recommencing at the beginning of the new year. So I thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you enjoy these podcasts well into the future. And do leave me some comments and thoughts about what you'd like to hear in future, so I can prepare and present you something which is of interest. And of course do head over to Instagram and watchchronicler.com to see more, whether it's photography, written content, or previews of videos visible here on the channel. So thank you very much for listening. This is Armand from watchchronicler.com. Out.